The US motorcycle market is changing, and Honda is standing right in the middle of that shift. Not because it screams louder than Harley, not because it sells some fantasy lifestyle, and not because riders suddenly stopped caring about tradition. Honda is winning because more riders are getting honest about what they actually need. A bike that starts, lasts, rides comfortably, does not drain the wallet, and keeps moving when others are sitting in the garage. That is the part legacy brands should be watching closely. Because when riders stop buying the dream and start buying the ownership reality, Honda does not look boring anymore. It looks dangerous. So watch until the end, because the real reason Honda is dominating says a lot about where American motorcycling is headed next, and which brands may get left behind. The old formula is failing. Something changed, and it didn't make noise. It didn't show up as a collapse or a headline. It showed up in what riders stopped doing. Bikes that used to leave the showroom and immediately rack up miles are now sitting longer in garages. Machines that once meant everything are becoming something else entirely. Not because they failed, but because the reason people bought them has shifted underneath the surface. You can see it in the way people talk. Less about what a bike represents, more about what it actually does. Less about image, more about use. Riders are still passionate, still loyal to the road, but the old formula of buying into a lifestyle first and figuring out the riding later is starting to wear thin. The gap between owning and riding is getting harder to ignore. For years, the industry leaned on identity. You weren't just buying a motorcycle, you were buying into something bigger. A statement, a symbol, a piece of who you were supposed to be. And that worked for a long time. But now, more riders are stepping back and asking a simple question: does this machine actually fit how I ride today? Because when a bike sits more than it moves, something feels off. And when that feeling spreads across enough garages, the market doesn't crash, it shifts. Quietly, steadily, and without asking permission. The riders didn't disappear. They just started making different choices. A closer look at ownership starts to explain where that shift is coming from. Ownership is getting heavier. Owning a motorcycle used to feel light. You bought it, rode it, and it fit into your life without friction. That balance is getting harder to find. The weight of ownership isn't just about the machine anymore. It's about everything that comes with it, and that weight is starting to show. You can feel it when a bike becomes something you have to plan around instead of something you naturally reach for. When riding turns into something scheduled instead of something instinctive. The time, the effort, the responsibility, it all adds up. Not all at once, but enough that it changes how often the bike actually leaves the garage. There's also a quiet hesitation that wasn't there before. Riders thinking longer before committing. Not because they've lost interest, but because they've learned from experience. They know what ownership really looks like after the excitement fades. They've lived through the part nobody talks about when the sale is made. And that changes behavior. Fewer impulse decisions, more second thoughts, more attention to whether a bike will actually get used the way it should. When that mindset spreads, it doesn't kill the market. It reshapes it. The machines that fit into real life start to stand out. The ones that demand too much start to get left behind, spend enough time around dealership floors, and that difference becomes impossible to miss. If this is already changing how you see the market, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What dealers are seeing. Walk into enough dealerships, and a pattern starts to show itself. Not in what's being promoted, but in what's actually leaving. Some bikes draw attention, others draw buyers. And those two things are not always the same. You'll see rows of machines that look the part, carry the right badge, and check every box on paper. Yet, they sit. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Not because they're bad bikes, but because they're not aligning with what riders are actually choosing anymore. Meanwhile, other machines move quietly. No spectacle, no drama, just steady turnover. Dealers notice that. They have to. Their business depends on what sells, not what gets talked about. The bikes that keep moving are the ones that keep the lights on. That reality shapes what gets recommended, what gets pushed a little harder, what gets positioned just right on the floor. There's no announcement when that shift happens. No meeting where everyone agrees to change direction. It happens through repetition, through watching what leaves and what doesn't, through understanding that consistency matters more than excitement when it comes to survival. Over time, that quiet preference becomes a pattern, and that pattern starts to influence the entire market, one sale at a time. The bikes that move aren't always the ones people expect. They're the ones that fit into a rider's life without resistance. Let's talk about what those machines have in common, and the answer becomes clearer. The bikes riders trust. The bikes that get ridden the most rarely try to impress. They don't demand attention, and they don't ask for it either. They just do what they're supposed to do every time. Start when you need them, run without surprises, and stay out of the way of the ride itself. There's a kind of trust that builds around machines like that, not because they're perfect, but because they're predictable. You know what you're getting every time you throw a leg over. No second guessing, no hesitation, just a bike that's ready when you are. And that matters more than people admit, because riding isn't about thinking through every detail before you leave. It's about going. The less a machine interrupts that, the more it gets used. The more it gets used, the more it becomes part of your routine instead of something separate from it. That's why simpler machines tend to stay active, not because they're lacking, but because they're focused. They don't try to do everything. They just do enough, consistently, without demanding attention. Over time, that consistency becomes their strongest advantage. Riders start to gravitate toward that without even realizing it, not as a statement, not as a trend, just as a natural response to what works. And when enough riders make that same quiet decision, the market begins to follow in a direction that feels less like a shift and more like a correction, built for real riders. The difference starts in how the machine is imagined before it is ever built. Some bikes are designed for ideal conditions, assuming everything will be done exactly right. Others are designed with the understanding that real life doesn't work that way. Honda falls into that second category, and it shows in how their bikes behave once they leave the showroom. Out on the road, maintenance doesn't always happen on schedule. Oil changes get delayed, filters get ignored. Riding conditions aren't clean, controlled, or predictable. A machine built for perfection struggles in that environment. A machine built with tolerance in mind keeps going anyway. That distinction becomes clear over time, not in a single ride, but across months and years of use. There's a quiet respect that comes from knowing a bike will forgive small mistakes, not because it encourages neglect, but because it understands reality. Riders aren't always working in perfect conditions, and machines that expect that tend to fail when it matters most. Honda approaches this differently, building with the assumption that things will go wrong at some point. That mindset creates something stronger than performance on paper. It creates confidence. You know the bike isn't going to punish you for every missed detail. You know it's going to keep running even when things aren't ideal. That kind of consistency doesn't need to be advertised. It gets proven through use. Seen from that angle, it becomes easier to understand why riders tend to stay once they start with something that works like that. Why riders stay with Honda. There's a certain ease that comes from not having to relearn everything every time you switch machines. Controls feel familiar. The way the bike responds feels predictable. That continuity removes friction, and over time, it becomes one of the biggest reasons riders stay where they are. Moving from one Honda to another doesn't feel like starting over. It feels like stepping into something that already makes sense. The layout is intuitive, the behavior is consistent, and the adjustment period is almost non-existent. That matters more than most people realize, especially for riders who just want to get on and ride without thinking through every detail again. Over time, that familiarity builds trust, not just in one model, but in the entire lineup. You know what to expect before you even turn the key. There's no guessing, no adapting to a completely different feel. That makes the transition from one bike to the next feel natural instead of disruptive. It also changes how decisions are made. Instead of evaluating every option from scratch, riders often stay within what they already understand. not out of habit, but because it works. The system holds together, and that consistency keeps people from looking elsewhere. Look beyond the machine itself, and another layer of that advantage starts to show. Parts, service, and trust. Owning a motorcycle isn't just about riding it. It's about everything that happens when something needs attention. That's where access becomes more important than most people expect. Not the kind you think about when buying, but the kind you depend on later. Parts availability can turn a minor issue into a quick fix or a long delay. When components are easy to find, problems get solved quickly. When they're not, the bike sits. Over time, that difference shapes how often a machine actually gets used. Riders gravitate toward what keeps them moving, not what leaves them waiting. Service access plays the same role. When help is nearby and available, ownership feels manageable. When it requires long waits or complicated arrangements, it becomes a burden. That's not something you notice right away, but it becomes obvious the first time you need it. There's also a ripple effect. When repairs are straightforward, they don't turn into ongoing issues. They get handled, and the bike goes back to doing what it's supposed to do. That kind of support structure keeps ownership simple, even when things don't go perfectly. Taken together, that access creates a kind of stability. Not flashy, not something that shows up in marketing, but something riders feel over time. And that feeling shapes how they choose their next machine. That leads directly into why the decision itself starts to feel easier. The safer buy. Every purchase carries a level of uncertainty. You're not just choosing a machine, you're committing to everything that comes with it over time. Some decisions feel heavier than others, and that weight often determines what riders are willing to take on. With Honda, there's a sense of predictability that reduces that uncertainty. You know what the bike is going to be like before you even ride it. You know how it behaves, how it responds, and how it fits into daily use. That familiarity lowers the barrier to committing. There's also clarity in what you're getting. No surprises, no hidden expectations. The machine does what it's built to do, and it does it consistently. That kind of straightforward experience removes a lot of the doubt that comes with trying something unfamiliar. It also makes it easier to move on when the time comes. Not because there's anything wrong, but because the process doesn't feel complicated. Riders aren't locked into something unpredictable. They're working within a system that stays stable over time. That sense of control changes how decisions are made. Instead of worrying about what might go wrong, riders focus on what already works. And when enough people start thinking that way, it explains why one brand keeps showing up in garages more often than others. The bike's sitting too long. Something becomes obvious the moment you start paying attention to what isn't happening. The bikes that used to move quickly are starting to slow down. Not across the board, not all at once, but enough that it stands out. Inventory that once rotated steadily now lingers longer than expected. Machines that used to leave the floor with confidence are now being looked at, reconsidered, and sometimes left behind. There's a hesitation that wasn't there before. Buyers are taking their time. Walking around, stepping back, thinking it through instead of making a quick decision. It's not that interest is gone. It's that the urgency has faded. That shift changes everything because it stretches out the time between interest and commitment. Impulse buying is becoming rare. The idea of walking in, seeing something, and immediately deciding to take it home doesn't carry the same weight anymore. Riders are asking more questions, thinking further ahead, and considering how the bike will actually fit into their lives once the excitement settles. That kind of thinking slows movement without killing demand. When machines stop moving quickly, it creates pressure, not dramatic, not immediate, but steady. The longer something sits, the more it becomes part of the background instead of the focus. And once that happens, it's harder to bring it back to the front again. Watch closely, and you'll notice that what's slowing down isn't random. It follows a pattern, and that pattern has less to do with the machine itself and more to do with what it represents. That realization opens the door to a deeper issue that's been building quietly. If this breakdown made you rethink what's really happening in the market, subscribe now because this isn't slowing down. Image is losing power. For a long time, image did most of the work. The look, the feel, the idea behind the machine. It carried the decision forward. You didn't just buy the bike, you bought into what it stood for. That connection made everything else easier to accept. The trade-offs, the compromises, even the parts that didn't quite make sense. That influence is starting to weaken. Not disappearing, but losing its ability to carry the entire decision. Riders are still drawn to identity, but they're no longer willing to let it override everything else. The question has shifted from, what does this say about me, to what does this actually do for me? That shift changes how value is measured. Image alone doesn't justify ownership the way it used to. It still matters, but it has to stand alongside something more practical. Something that holds up once the bike becomes part of daily life instead of just a symbol. There's also a growing awareness. Riders recognizing the gap between perception and reality. Not in a cynical way, but in a practical one. They've lived with machines long enough to understand what matters after the first ride. That experience reshapes expectations. The result is a quieter, more deliberate decision-making process. One where branding still plays a role, but no longer dominates. And when that balance changes, it affects every part of the market. A different perspective begins to emerge when you look at how new riders are stepping into that same space. New riders want practicality. There's a noticeable difference in how new riders approach the same decision. Not better or worse, just different. They're stepping into the market without the same expectations that shaped previous generations, without the same assumptions about what a motorcycle is supposed to represent. For many of them, the starting point isn't identity, it's usability, how the bike fits into their life, how often it can be used, how easily it becomes part of their routine. That perspective changes the entire entry point into riding. It makes the decision more grounded from the beginning. There's also less attachment to legacy, not because it isn't respected, but because it isn't personal yet. Without years of connection to a specific brand or style, the choice becomes more open, more flexible, more focused on what works right now instead of what has always been. That approach leads to different priorities. Simplicity over complexity, function over tradition, practical use over long-standing expectations. It doesn't reject the past, but it doesn't depend on it either. It builds something new alongside it. The full impact becomes clearer once those same riders move beyond the purchase and into ownership. After the sale, truth hits. The moment after buying is where everything settles into place. The excitement fades, the routine begins, and the real experience of ownership takes over. That's where expectations meet reality, and where decisions are either reinforced or questioned. What seemed manageable at first can start to feel different over time. The effort required to keep things running smoothly. The attention needed to stay on top of everything. None of it is overwhelming on its own, but together, it shapes how the bike fits into daily life. There's also a shift in perspective. What mattered before the purchase doesn't always carry the same weight afterward. The focus moves from what the bike represents to how it behaves, from how it looks to how it feels to live with. That transition reveals things that aren't obvious at the beginning. Some riders adapt to that without hesitation. Others start to reassess, not because they made a mistake, but because the reality is clearer now. They begin to think about what they would do differently next time, what they would prioritize, what they would avoid, what they would change. In the end, the consequence isn't dramatic. It's gradual. A steady adjustment in how riders choose, what they value, and what they expect. And that gradual shift is what continues to reshape the market, one experience at a time. The industry is reacting. Look across the industry long enough, and you start to notice subtle shifts in direction. Not loud announcements or sudden pivots, but quiet adjustments that signal something deeper is happening. Manufacturers are beginning to respond, even if they don't openly admit what they're responding to. The changes show up in product lines, in design choices, and in how new machines are positioned. There's a growing presence of smaller, more straightforward motorcycles entering the lineup, not stripped-down versions of something bigger, but machines that are clearly meant to reduce complexity. They're easier to live with, easier to approach, and built with fewer demands on the rider. That direction isn't accidental. It reflects a recognition that the old formula isn't covering every need anymore. At the same time, there's a visible tension. Brands that built their identity around a certain image are now trying to balance that with practicality. They want to maintain what made them recognizable, while also adapting to what riders are starting to expect. That balance isn't easy. Lean too far one way, and the identity weakens. Lean too far the other, and the product loses relevance. A broader force is pushing that change forward, one that extends beyond any single manufacturer. Money is changing choices. Step back from the motorcycles themselves, and a larger pattern comes into focus. The way people spend money is changing, and that change doesn't stay contained within one industry. It influences how decisions are made, what gets prioritized, and how value is defined across the board. There's a growing awareness of where money goes and what it returns. Purchases are being examined more closely, not just at the moment of buying, but over time. That perspective shifts attention toward things that hold up under real use, not just initial appeal. It's not about cutting back on passion, but about making sure that passion makes sense in the long run. Riders are part of that shift. They're looking at their choices through a wider lens, considering how a motorcycle fits into everything else. Not just the ride itself, but the place it occupies in daily life. That broader view changes how decisions are approached, making them more deliberate and less reactive. Seen from that perspective, the changes in motorcycles are part of something larger. And within that larger shift, the meaning of riding itself begins to evolve. What riding means is changing. Riding has always carried meaning beyond the machine. For some, it's about freedom. For others, it's about identity, community, or tradition. Those meanings don't disappear, but they do shift over time, shaped by how people actually use their motorcycles. There's a gradual move toward something more grounded. Less emphasis on being seen, more emphasis on being out there riding. The focus shifts from presentation to experience, from how the bike looks parked to how it feels in motion. That change isn't dramatic, but it's steady. Practical use is gaining respect in a way it didn't always have, not as a replacement for passion, but as a different expression of it. Riding more often, in more situations, with fewer barriers between the rider and the road. That kind of engagement builds a deeper connection than something that only comes out on occasion. At the same time, there's still room for everything else. The nostalgia, the pride, the tradition. They remain part of the culture. They just don't carry the entire weight anymore. They exist alongside a growing appreciation for what works in everyday conditions. All of that leads to a final piece of the puzzle, one that ties everything together. What Honda got right. Long before the shift became visible, there was a different way of looking at motorcycles. Not as symbols first, but as tools that needed to work under real conditions. That perspective didn't rely on predicting trends or reacting to pressure. It focused on something simpler and more durable, how people actually use their machines. Honda built around that reality, not for ideal riders in perfect situations, but for everyday use in imperfect conditions. That approach shaped everything, from how the bikes behaved to how they fit into a rider's life. It wasn't about creating the most impressive machine. It was about creating one that kept working. That consistency matters more than it first appears. It builds trust over time, not through promises, but through repeated experience. Riders come to expect a certain outcome, and that expectation becomes part of how decisions are made. Not consciously, not always directly, but as a quiet confidence in what will happen next. In the end, the story isn't about one brand overtaking another. It's about a way of thinking that proved to be more durable than the alternatives. A focus on use instead of perception, on consistency instead of hype. And as the market continues to evolve, that foundation remains, steady and unchanged, while everything else moves around it. So maybe Honda's dominance is not about noise or hype at all. It is about riders finally choosing the motorcycle that keeps them moving after the showroom excitement fades. Reliability, comfort, parts, value, and trust are starting to matter more than image alone. That should make every legacy brand pay attention. If you have seen this shift where you ride, tell us in the comments, hit like if this made sense, and subscribe for more straight-talking motorcycle truth from the road and the garage.